So, Scott Johnson, host of What Was That Like? Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
I am delighted to be here.
Scott, we're testing out a new format, and in the interest of making the show more engaging for listeners and people that might be just finding us for the first time, because this is a show where we talk to podcasters about podcasting, I thought it might be helpful to ask you, what's the biggest impact that podcasting has made in your life?
Well, aside from just now being able to be a full time podcaster, that's a nice thing in itself. But I would have to say it's gratification. The gratification of seeing the effect the show has on other people and guests and listeners. I've had many guests tell me that it's been so therapeutic for them to tell their story from beginning to end in detail to someone who is really interested in hearing it. And I've had a few people say, this happened a little while ago and they're worried about forgetting the details. And so now they've got all the details recorded and it's there forever. They don't have to worry about trying to keep that all in their head. So, and I've had some listeners as well. That early on, I did an interview with a man who donated a kidney to a stranger. And that was like one of my first 10 episodes. And that was 6 years ago. And I've had several listeners say, I heard that. I'm going to go donate a kidney. So, so I just love seeing, how the podcast can benefit people.
So we got reconnected at Podcast Movement. As of this recording, it's September 2024, and I was speaking at Podcast Movement. I think it was about my third or fourth time. So shout out to the team. That event has just been getting bigger and bigger. And I remember 10 years ago attending my first Podcast Movement. It was in a smaller hotel. I think it was just 2 days, but it's amazing to see. Kudos to Dan and Jared and the team for what they've done. I think at this point, they've got a bigger company that's moved in. I'm wondering what your experience has been like over the years with the conference.
I have gone to several podcast movements, both the evolutions and the other one, the industry oriented one, as well as Podfest. I really like that one. And they kind of serve different functions. The podcast movement's more, networks and industry people, and Podfest is more like a family sort of with indie creators and everything. And I like both. And, when I first started going, definitely a planner. I would plan, I'd look at the speaker schedule and say, okay, I'm going to be here this time, here, this one, and then Wednesday, and then Thursday. And now I don't, I still attend some of the sessions, but the real value is meeting people. And, you see people, other podcasters you can collaborate with. And I've found some guests at podcasting conferences. And I think that's the real big takeaway from those things.
Have you been able to speak yet on any of the stages about the show?
I've spoken at Podfest. I've never really applied to speak at Podcast Movement. I don't mind, and I put in to speak at Podfest this coming January, so we'll see. But yeah, I can take it or leave it. I don't get too excited about public speaking, but I'll do it.
So we've been in the same circles for a while, and I know we've run into each other in passing at past conferences. So how far back does podcasting go for you?
I started podcasting in 2012. And that was not the podcast I'm doing now. I had a computer business. And so I would do like a weekly computer tip or trick or something for non techie people. And really, it was just designed to get me more computer clients. And so I did, I don't know, probably 300 or 400 weekly episodes of that. And then I had to stop because, my new show's just taking too much time. And honestly, I'm kind of trying to get away from I still have my computer business, but it's kind of fading into the background while my podcasting takes the front seat.
What, is that what you studied? Computers? Is that your background?
No, I'm completely self-taught.
Okay.
Yeah, I started my computer business when we lived up north in Maine. I walked into a print shop and there was a little note on the counter that said, I need someone to help me learn Microsoft Word. And so I thought, well, I know how to use Microsoft Word. So I contacted that woman. And so I thought after spending a couple of hours with her, I said, I could do this as kind of a side gig. So I started a business. I called it the Computer Tutor. And I started, and it just, that was more than 20 years ago. And so it's been my full-time income for quite some time.
What's your earliest memory of computers or tech? Do you remember the first one you ever had?
Oh man, I remember my first computer PC was Windows 95
Oh yeah. Okay.
way back then. Yeah, it was amazing back then.
I got lucky because my dad was into computer repairs, and he brought home one of the first like electronic typewriters. He used to work at Exxon when they were doing. They had a division called Quix, QYX, and it was this behemoth of a typewriter that probably weighed 50 to 60 pounds, and it had one little LCD like strip that was like the digital screen, and so you could type out one line of like text, and then correct it if you needed to, and then you hit return, it'd go and it typed the one line. So it was like the first, electronic. And then early days of that Tandy 1000. Texas Instruments probably was the first one because
I had one of those.
the cassette recorder was my memory.
Did you ever have a Radio Shack TRS-80?
I didn't have the TRS-80. I did that. I think I went straight. I had the. Oh wait, maybe I did. I think I did. Yeah, I think I did have a TRS-80. The timing is a little off because I know there was a Texas Instruments, there was a TRS-80. I never got the Commodore 64. I always wanted.
Oh, I was big on the Commodore 64. Yeah, for sure.
My friend had one of those. I'd go over to his house and play with.
I remember spending hours. You'd get the monthly Commodore 64 magazine, and it would have pages and pages of code. And in order to run a program, you'd have to type in all that code. And then to save it was a cassette player. And oh, man, how far we've come.
And then the floppy disks, and then the modems.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And the 2400-bit modem, and you would get to like a 9600-bit modem was like super fast.
Oh, yeah. Supersonic speed there.
I'm sure I'm bringing back some fond memories for you, especially in the computer era, because at that time, it's really new tech, and obviously new tech now. You think about AI and stuff like that, but back then, like teaching people to use like a computer and just Word or even DOS prompt stuff, like was like really futuristic stuff at the time. We were in that transitionary phase.
It was amazing back then. I remember on the Commodore 64 getting on local bulletin boards, and that's how we would communicate with people.
Yeah.
So
And so, are you Mac or PC now?
I'm all PC.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I can stay busy enough doing PC repairs that I don't really have to do Macs, and I'm not a huge fan of Macs just because I just always use Windows and it works fine.
So, what made you start a podcast for the computer stuff? Like, what were you listening to, or what was your foray? I'm just always curious how people hear about it for the first time.
Well, I started listening to podcasts just before that, like 2010 or 2011, and
Which wasn't easy to do back then.
right. Yeah. You download it and you got your MP3 player you got to transfer over and all that stuff. But I was listening and, it just occurred to me that I should have a podcast. Anybody can do this. And not that there was a ton of people listening to podcasts at that time, but just, I already put out a weekly newsletter by email. And so I really just took that content that I was already writing and putting together and just verbalized it into a podcast and just started going that way.
Sort of. And who were you like? Where'd you get guidance from at that point? Because nowadays we just take it for granted. You just go to YouTube and look up anything you need to. Back then, so there's probably some OGs back then, and not a lot of people teaching. I think you were just probably following by example, I guess.
Yeah, the one that was available back then was Dave Jackson, School of Podcasting. So yeah, he helped me set up the first podcast, and that's how it rolled because I had no idea how to do it, but he does.
Yeah, total true podcast OG, and it's always good to see him at Podcast Movement. And he's such a it's almost like a respected elder statesman at this point.
Like we need to kiss the ring or something here, right?
It's so great to see that he partnered up with Brendan over at Podpage.
Yeah, yeah, that's a perfect match, I think. Yeah.
He loves he's an educator. That's his background. He loves teaching, and I'm sure he did some good things at Lipson. But I feels like he's in his sweet spot now, and working with podcasters just getting started, helping them start their show. And I think there's now even like an Ask Dave corner in the newsletter or something like that or on the website.
Okay, I haven't seen that yet. That's
So when you were finishing up this, or you were thinking like this computer show was winding down, talk to me about the origin story for what was that like?
well, I found myself listening to other podcasts, and I really liked the episodes that I liked the best are where somebody's telling a story. And I mean, there's such power in that, you can hold people's attention if you know how to tell a story anyway. And especially if it was a true story. And I found that there was no other show doing it, like, at least not the way I would do it. And so I thought, well, I'm already doing a podcast. I know how to do a podcast. I can just start another one. And so that's what it was. And I got really lucky with my guest for the very first episode. It was a woman who accidentally killed someone, and she came on and told that whole story in detail. And I even had when it was a motorcycle that hit her car when she pulled into an intersection, and I she was in the road with him calling 911, and I have that 911 recording and included that. And yeah, I mean, it was a home run right from episode 1. It really, caught people's attention.
And I'm always curious because we have folks that are been podcasting for a while that might be even thinking about a new show or may just be interested in podcasting and getting ideas for a show themselves. How do you go about, or what was the process for going about thinking of that show topic? And then did you just go on your socials and say, hey, I'm going to start a show, this is what it's going to call, and I'm looking for people to tell stories?
Well, I did that, yes. There was multiple research processes, I think. And one, just practically speaking, is the domain name was available, what was that like.com. So, that's a big advantage, right there. But yeah, I mean, people love hearing these crazy stories. And that's what we do. I talk to people who've been attacked by grizzly bears or in a mass shooting or in a plane crash. I've done a few plane crashes, and we do fun ones too. I have somebody that goes on The Price is Right and wins the showcase, or stuff like that. People love hearing the behind the scenes, all the details.
Yeah. And so as you started getting momentum, was it you were finding easier and easier for people to just submit stories to you?
When I first started, of course, you don't have an audience when you start, so I made a list of people or stories that I would like to have come on the show. Like somebody that got struck by lightning, or I don't know, somebody got stung by yellow jackets, and or whatever. And then I just went online and started looking for those stories and trying to contact people. And that's when you see a story like that and you really want to talk to someone. It's You really hope they have an unusual name, because when you go on Facebook and look for John Smith, oh no, I'm not going to find that person. So yeah, so I just started contacting people and saying, hey, you want to tell your story, come on the show.
So you mentioned it's a bit of a skill to tell a good story. What were you doing? And if anything has maybe changed over the years, like how do you prep people to tell a good story? Are there things that you tell them to do prior to coming on the show, or maybe some examples you can give them so that otherwise they'll just give you the facts and you've got 15 minutes of the show used up and then like it's over.
I've had that happen. One of the things that I tell them ahead of time is this has to be a story that's going to take 45 minutes to an hour and sometimes longer to tell. And I actually had a guy who was at home with his little boy, feeding him breakfast, and a plane crashed into their house, starting it on fire and all that. He told that story in 15 minutes. How do you do that?
Yeah.
So, but that was one of the early ones. But yeah, now I do a pre chat with every single guest, because the people that I talk to don't normally get interviewed. They're not public speakers. They're nervous about coming on. And if we can do a pre chat where, it's just like you and I are sitting here talking, they know exactly what to expect and they're going to be able to see me. And it's just a conversation between two people. And I tell them, this is not live, it's recorded. If you mess up, or if you need to take a drink or pause to how to answer a question or something, it all gets edited and you're going to sound wonderful. And I learned something from Tim Ferriss. He said, it's good. I mean, you want people to be vulnerable with you when they're telling their story. So the way you do that is you be vulnerable with them first. So what I usually say is, sometimes I'm going to ask you a question and I'm just going to completely screw it up. So what I do then is I just back up and I say, okay, we're going to ask that question again. And then we go from there. So they know, even if I screw up, it doesn't matter. They're going to screw up. But honestly, from a practical standpoint, once people get in like that after the first 5 or 10 minutes of telling this story, it's just you and me and the guest. And they're not nervous anymore. So, and I try to make them sound as good as possible in the editing process.
So I'm curious, like how you can create that safe space because I've been in situations just by virtue of like me having long form conversations with my guests, and every once in a while they'll mention something, I'll pull that thread, and before you know it, they're revealing something like really personal. And I found over the years it's this idea of being comfortable with silence, right? You ask an open-ended question, and a lot of times this is why I was doing video from day one. Like, I want to see the body language. I want to see the reaction, because you ask sometimes a tough question. You can see them like sort of tense up. Maybe their eyes start to water up a little bit, or they were just triggered in a way where they realized, oh, like and then they're trying to figure out, am I going to tell like the easy answer or the true answer? And they know in their mind that the true answer is going to take some time, and it's going to be challenging, and it's going to be emotional. And they're processing that within seconds, right? You're watching this in their facial reactions, and they're just like, and they're thinking, do I really want to go here? And so I'm curious, as you've seen these moments evolve, how you've gotten better about like managing that energy.
Yes. Oh, I love when that happens. And the advantage that I have now is that I've got like 190 episodes. So people that I don't have to go contacting people anymore. The audience brings me their stories. Some of them I use, some of them I don't, most of them I don't, but they have already heard how I handle those vulnerable moments. And so I've had so many of them say, this is going to be a tough thing for me to talk about, but I know how you do it and I trust you completely. And that it's an incredible honor for me, to bring people these stories. And I've had many guests that have cried, openly while they're telling their story, which is understandable. And that's what makes gripping content.
What guidance would you give for a host that's looking to create a show, storytelling show, possibly emotional stories? How have you learned to be better, maybe a better listener, a better holder of like space, and I'm sure you've gotten better at this over the years, but like what guidance would you give someone like to hone that skill set?
Man, I have gotten better at it for sure. Because now, if I go back and listen to my early episodes, it's like, Scott, shut up and let him answer. I just talk too much. So now, yeah, I try to just kind of get out of the way, let them tell the story. It's not all them. I intervene sometimes with a clarifying question or something like that. But the listeners are there to hear their story, not me. And I don't know where I was going with that, but that's what I really.
Just, you were saying, just being a better listen, just learning how to be a better listener and just coaxing the story out of them.
Yes, yes, and silence is fine. There's nothing wrong with silence. If it goes too long, you can always edit it in, later on. But and what I'll do sometimes is, depending on how I ask a question or depending on how they answer a question, I'll just edit out my question completely.
Oh yeah, yeah,
If it sounds like it's a continuous thought that they're having, and that's it makes them sound like a really good storyteller,
yeah.
because they're just going.
Yeah, we had a previous guest on, Natalie Jennings, who's my partner, but she's got a show she originally did called A Face Project. And she'd do long form interviews, but she'd do the interview and then she'd edit herself completely out. So, and she's a photographer also, so she would take pictures, and she printed some hardcover books of like the sessions. But I always thought it was interesting to listen to them because, to your point, if it's the editing is done really well, the person just sounds like a natural storyteller, and everything is flowing well, and it's just like, oh, they're pulling you through the story and it's making sense and it's in order. When you have a story that's a bit complicated, that has a lot of moving parts, I, I imagine you're conscious of it, maybe from the pre-talk, that there's certain key elements in the story that you want to make sure are included. Have there been situations where you can sense that they're giving you the shortened version, and there's other pieces that maybe in the pre-talk they talked about, but that they're leaving out, and you're trying to find a nice way to like pull those back in?
Fortunately, when someone submits a story, they can go to my website and submit their story, and I tell them right on that page that when you're sending the story, the more details you can give me, the better, because I use what they send me to create my own show notes, or not show notes, but my notes for the conversation. And so I have usually 2 or 3 pages of single space notes of their whole story, kind of the way they told it, but also, I want to maybe dig into this thing. Like, what were you thinking when that happened? What's going through your mind, And I also tell people it's good to have bullet points in front of you just so that you remember all the details. I've had a couple of guests who we went through the whole thing, and a couple of days later they contacted me saying, I forgot to say this one thing, and I really wanted to say that, and can we just do it again? And so we recorded again, And the second time, oh, beautiful. They had their notes. They were ready with all the stuff. So yeah, so I learned from that. It's good to have people with, have their notes in front of them.
So it'd be obviously with a show titled "What Was That Like?" with so many stories. I think you said over 190.
Something like that now. Yeah.
So, do you have? There's got to be some that stand out, and I know it's hard. Every podcaster hates this question. What's your favorite guest or what's your favorite episode? So I've been on the receiving end of those, so I know what that feeling is like. But are there some memorable ones that sometimes you hear a story and it hits, it hits you and it stays with you for a while.
Oh man, I've got a few like that. Yeah. The one for a lot of my listeners, they will say, I've listened to every one of your episodes, but there's one episode that some people say, there's just that one I can't listen to. And it's always the same one. And it's a guy who he and his friends would hang out and talk and just ask, crazy questions. And one of the questions that they asked themselves one time is, if you had the opportunity to taste human flesh and it was legal and ethical and maybe even healthy, would you do it? And they said, yeah, sure, I'd try that, knowing it would never happen, of course. Well, sometime after that, that guy had a motorcycle. He was in a motorcycle accident and he had to have his foot amputated. And when he was leaving the hospital, he said, hey, can I have my foot? And so they had him sign some, disclaimers and liability papers and all that. But he took his foot home. Then he started calling his friends saying, okay, hey, remember that conversation we had? And they were up for it. He had like 10 friends over. They called it foot tacos, and one of his friends is a chef. So, and he's got pictures of all this too. They're putting in the peppers and spices, and so each of them got like a 2-inch square, piece of foot, and so that's one. But I mean, as far as stories that really, really, I mean, I've had so many that people say, "Man, I heard that, and I am never going to forget that story." There was one with a guest named Courtney, and her mom had terminal cancer, and this was in Canada. And in Canada, they have a thing called MAID, MAID, medical assistance in death. And so her mom knew she was going to die, and she wanted to do that on her own terms. And she told that whole story. And yeah, you'll be crying when you hear that one. And Courtney was crying too. So, but yeah, I've got so many like that. I mean, these are stories that of people that have experienced something really traumatic. And in a lot of cases, when they tell that story in detail, they're reliving that day. And yeah, sometimes the worst day of their life. And that's why I can't say how grateful I am to these people who are willing to do this. And the reason a lot of them are willing to is because they now have a cause. They want something, they want to promote something, promote awareness of something so that what happened to them doesn't happen to other people. And so that's when we talk about that at the end. So even though we're all crying, we kind of end on a positive note many times.
Do you have some guests that end up making that almost like their life's work or their mission because of what happened to them, that it was so impactful that they've gone on to like start a charity or build an organization that supports that cause?
Yeah, yeah, I sure have several of them. There's a friend of mine named Laura. She was, I think, episode 151, and she and her husband had a little child, a year and a half old. Her husband's name was Aaron. Her son's name was Anderson. Laura worked from home. Aaron worked in an office, and so he took Anderson one day. Their schedule was off, and anyway, he was taking Anderson to drop him off at daycare and then go on to work. And Laura didn't hear from the daycare to say, okay, how's the baby doing? So she called daycare and they said he didn't show up today. And that's when she called Aaron, and Aaron went out to his car and realized that he had left the baby in the car. And Anderson did not survive. And so the rest of that story is that Aaron couldn't live with that. He took his own life the same day.
God.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Laura lost her husband and her son without any warning on the same day. Well, that was it was like more than 2 years ago. And now she started a nonprofit called Anderson's Alert. And she works with an organization called Kids and Cars. And they promote car safety, and she's really working on getting laws changed as far as backseat technology, so people can't just forget, because it's easy to do. It can happen to anyone. And they were the best parents in the world. Laura's a good friend of mine now since we've done this episode. And so I know her very well, and she was the best mom. And so it can happen to anybody. But that's her mission now. She's looking to change things.
I mean, you sort of alluded to it a little bit there, but how has the show changed you personally? And you hear all, I mean, 190 of these stories. I'm wondering how it's affected you in your day-to-day life or into your interactions with your own family.
It's made me think none of us should judge anyone because we don't know, we don't have any idea what they've been through. So many people have been through trauma, and you're just walking by somebody, and maybe you're in a car and they cut you off in traffic, or they do something in a store, ticks you off or whatever. I've really worked hard on giving people the benefit of the doubt, and stuff like that.
So, as the show has gotten popular, you alluded to it taking up more of your time now. I saw that you now have patrons for the show. So, talk a little bit about logistically kind of peek behind the curtain, like how the show has been for you from a production schedule and when you started to think that this is actually going to be something that might end up being more of a full-time job for you.
I had that thought in the back of my mind right when I started it, just because I know the power of a story. And with stories like this, I didn't see any way it could not be a big show. And so, but you start with no audience, and obviously if you're going to get sponsors, you got to have an audience. And so I went the first 3 years before I even started thinking about having any sponsors on, because I wanted the audience to be big enough that it would be worthwhile. I don't want to play an ad and annoy everyone with an ad and make $50 from it or something. So that's when I did start Patreon earlier than that, but that wasn't. I didn't even withdraw the Patreon money for until it got up to where it was substantial. It just sat there. But yeah, after 3 years, I joined and worked with an ad agency, and they started looking for sponsors. And now I'm with Glassbox Media. I've been with them almost 2 years. Super happy with them. If you got a decent sized show and you're looking to monetize it, I would highly recommend it.
So, what aspects of the show does Glassbox help with?
They find the sponsors
Okay.
and they handle all of that. And with as far as collecting the money and everything, and they take a percentage, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And they have set me up on Apple podcast subscriptions. So I had been planning to do that anyway, but Apple has all these hoops you got to jump through, and I said, okay, I'll do that sometime, just not. So when I went with Glassbox, they said, okay, let's get that set up, and it's done. And same thing with supporting Cast. So for people that use Android, and I still have my Patreon as well. So multiple sources of income, and they also bring in dynamic programmatic ads as well.
And have you developed? You mentioned obviously you've building some relationships up with the guests on the show. But the listeners, you said you've got people that have been listening to a majority of the back catalog. Have you started to develop a community around the listeners as well?
Oh, I sure have. And I know all of my listeners. See, my audience is probably 75% women, roughly between the ages of 25 and 30, or up to like 50, 60. And they are on Facebook. So that's where our community is. We've got a podcast listener Facebook group of about 8,000 people. So, and I've enjoyed interacting with them there, not just, hanging out and chatting with them, but it's also a great sounding board. If I think a story might be interesting, well, I don't want to do it if it's just I think that's interesting. I want to find out, do you guys want to hear this? So I'll do a poll. And, if it's more than 90% yes, then yeah, we'll bring that guest on.
Have you ever had the tables turned on you for you to share your what was like that story?
I don't actually have a story like that not that would qualify for the show anyway. I usually tell people you really don't want to have something happen to you that qualifies you to be a guest on my show.
That's true. Well, there's a couple of fun ones, and have you had any lottery winners that blew it all?
No, I'm looking for a lottery winner. Actually, there's some lottery winners that will do AMAs on Reddit, and so I've contacted a few of them. One of them said, why would I want to come on a show? People are just going to be contacting me for money, and but they can be anonymous. I have to verify. I verify each story, but they can still be anonymous, so nobody really knows who they are. But I haven't done. I do want to do a lottery winner, but I want it to be multi millions that they've won, and be at least a year or two after they get the money, because how do they handle it? And are they broke again, like a lot of people are?
I would think the majority of them are because the people that play the lotto are people who usually like, really desperate for the money and they're not in the best financial situation and probably not in the best, living situation. And you can just see all the family and friends coming out of the woodwork and them trying to be super generous. And like, I think it's a high number, 70, 80% of those people, like they've usually blown it all within like 5 years, which is crazy.
It's bad. Yeah.
Do you find that yourself when you're amongst friends or with family that you're now a better storyteller?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I try to avoid crutch words, and I'm okay with pauses while I think how to say something. And I try to kind of structure the story. If I'm telling a story, you want to have it, there's a way to do it. And yeah, I think I'm better at it. But honestly, with this show, I'm not really telling the story. I'm just facilitating.
But what's fascinating, what I've learned is because I've had friends in my life and I've come across people that you hear them speak or you see them in a public setting and they are masterful storytellers. Like everyone is like, whether it's a campfire or just you're in a backyard barbecue, everyone is glued to them. Like, and they're just like, hanging on every word. And, but then you start to unpack like what they're doing. And to your point, like when it's done well, because you could tell the facts about what happened. I went there, hit by car, got out, the MDs came and but if you set up like the context of like it was a really tough day for me, this was happening, mindset, where I was, what the temperature was, it was sunny outside, you're painting this picture, right? And it's again the storytelling, right? The theater of the mind stuff, especially now yours is just audio. So that's probably even more people thinking. It happens when you read a good book. I read a good Stephen King book and I wake up the next day and I think about the characters in a way I'm like, oh no, that was the book. I was like, I'm thinking about these characters whose lives are painted so vividly for me. And so, with good storytelling, it's all the pieces of and all the things that are on the periphery that most people just disregard. But when you tell them, you realize like, oh, that was important and that was important, and you made a left there because of like some other thing that happened. And it's this start to think about all these sliding doors moments in your life, right? You make these minute decisions and before you know it, you end up with the stories that end up on your show.
And sometimes the details that you tell in the beginning may not seem relevant, but then, later on you call back to that and you realize, oh, I needed to know that. So I had someone send in a story. I end each episode with what I call a listener story. It's just a 5 to 10 minute story that a listener sends in, and we just play the audio of it. And I put it right at the end because people love that, and it keeps them listening all the way to the end. So, but I just had someone send in a story, and she recorded it and said, "Okay, This is the story of when my husband wrecked his motorcycle." And went to the hospital and he broke this particular bone. And then a month later, I wrecked the motorcycle and I broke the same bone and we saw the same doctor. And then she starts telling the story. Well, she's already told the story.
That's the story. There's not much else to
Right.
tell.
Why do people need to keep listening? So I told her that. I said, you could say there were a lot of coincidences and then just go into telling the story and then kind of sum it up at the end. There's just a way of doing it.
Yeah, because you have to have like a cliffhanger or an open loop or something for people to listen through to there's an art to that as well, right? Because if you give it all the way at the beginning, they're like, okay, thanks for that 30-second story.
Right. That's what, I hear people playing interview clips at the very opening of an episode, and there's a real art to that. You can't go too long because, I mean, people would assume, okay, what I'm hearing is this 1 minute clip of the best part of the episode of the conversation. So I've already heard it. I've got 10 episodes waiting for me. I can skip this one. So it's got to be the right level of tease versus advance information.
Have you given any thought to live performances?
I have thought about it, but I just don't think. I don't even do video because my guests do not want to be. They're nervous enough being on audio, and if they were on video, now they're worried about how they look and is their room behind them messy. As you can see behind me, I don't care because nobody sees that anyway. But yeah, I'd be open to a live performance, but when somebody's up on stage talking about I don't know, when they got attacked by or bitten by a rattlesnake or something. It's trauma is not necessarily good live entertainment.
No, it probably they'd have to be happy ending stories, I think.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so, how do you think about the future of the show? And do you, where are there opportunities for you to grow or for it to get more visibility? Is it just bigger guests with bigger stories?
Yeah, I'm always looking for new stories. Matter of fact, let me, I'll pull up my list here. There's a few that I'm looking for.
Put the call out now on the show.
Yeah, I'm looking, actually, since the beginning of the show, I've been looking for someone who has survived falling off a cruise ship while it was underway. That would be a good one. A passenger on a train that went over a cliff. Let's see.
Is that a thing?
Someone who's not an airplane pilot, but was on a flight where the pilot had a problem and you had to land the plane. That happens every once in a while. So,
That plane that went into the Hudson River, Scully.
yeah.
I worked at my last one of my last jobs in 9 to 5 was with an agency, and one of the reps there was on that plane. And he was on the plane. He was talking about how he was like he had his shoes off and he was all relaxed. And then like, if you see the video footage of it, like everyone had to get out and they had to get on the wing of the plane.
Right. They're standing on the wing while it's floating. Yeah.
Have you ever spoken to anyone from that flight?
No, but if you can connect me with that person,
I got to dig into that, yeah, because I'm sure he could tell that firsthand experience of what it was like to. I've never, everyone's been through turbulence, but to feel like, is this plane gonna make it? And then you're like flying through the canyons of New York City, like as this plane is trying to touch down into the Hudson River. I can only imagine what goes through people's minds at that point.
there is a guy that was on that plane. He was the last one off, and he has turned that experience into. I mean, he's a full-time keynote speaker. He's written a book, but honestly, I'd rather hear from the average guy and just tell me what happened. I tell people ahead of time, for people that, I mean, several of my guests have written a book, but I tell them ahead of time, I don't want you to tell the story like this happened. And then I learned these three things from that, and it just sounds like like the same speech they give everywhere. Yeah. So, but yeah, your guy that you talked about, he might be a good guest.
Yeah, he might be good. So I'm curious, when you go to these conferences, is it more to just engage with just fellow podcasters? Are you looking for ideas that you can do? Like, where are there tweaks you think in your show or in the process where you could maybe improve any aspect of it?
I would love to just streamline the process itself. I edit the show myself, and I don't think I could outsource that editing only because I know kind of the mindset that the guest was in, and I know like how I want it to sound overall at the end, the whole story. And an editor, yeah, they can take stuff out, they can move stuff around and everything, but they're not really going to have necessarily the same vision that I have for it. I think what I'm planning to do though is hire an editor to just do a first pass and take out the ums and you knows and clean it up some just to save me some time when I do the actual editing. But when I go to conferences, I'm just going there to meet people. I do promo trades with other shows, especially true crime shows. My show's not necessarily true crime. Some episodes are, but everybody in my audience loves true crime. So, yeah, we do promo trades, full episode swaps, looking for guests, or like when we met, I'm looking to guest on other shows too. So,
I mean, I remind podcasters that are just getting started, like just to use every single aspect. And I think one of my points in my talk was this idea of guerrilla marketing. Like you have to do these things that don't scale. And I remember when I would go to conferences that were podcast conferences, I would sit next to the aisle seat where the microphone was, because back in the day they put the microphone out and getting ready for like the Q&A part, right? And so I said, this is where the mic is. I'm going to sit next to it. And then when they say Q&A is ready, I would start heading up to the mic, and half the time I wouldn't even know what I was going to say. I was like, I was pushing myself out of my comfort zone. It was so uncomfortable, but you talk about being in uncomfortable situations.
that's amazing.
Everyone hates speaking in public. And thankfully I took some classes, so I got a little better. And then
But if you're walking to the mic, you got no choice. You got to think something.
but the first thing I would say is like, "Hey, Harry Duran, host of podcast Junkies." Like I would just, and then everyone's listening, right? And then there's like, "Oh, hey, Harry," I'm like, because they wouldn't know, because I don't have, a lot of my photos on the shows. But it's just like, again, and it's to your point of going out, meeting people in person, and sometimes you have to do this thing. And I'm curious, when you think about the work you've done to promote the episodes, putting on your marketing hat for a while, like what do you do now, and are there aspects of it that you could, enhance there?
I have, ever since I started the show, I've kept track of every marketing strategy that I've tried, and I'm going to write a book about it. I'm up to like 140 different tactics now. And it's not everybody's thinking, I just need this big break. I need for Joe Rogan to mention my show or, have it written up in the New York Times or something like that. That's just not how it happens. Those things are great if they do happen, but what you do instead of getting one big thing, you have to try out 100 little things and they each bring in a few listeners each time and you just keep doing that. That's what I've been doing for 6 years. I've got a checklist every time a new episode comes out. I post it on Facebook. I posted in about 60 different Facebook groups. I don't do that. I have somebody that does that for me now. But and I, it's on Instagram, it's on Reddit. I have my own subreddit for, on Reddit for the show. And of course, if it's a true crime episode, then I'll post it in the true crime groups as well. But yeah, you got to, like what you said, you got to think outside the box to get your name out there in front of people. There was here in my little town, I live in Safety Harbor, Florida. It's population about 18,000, and it's right in the Tampa Bay area. And, the city commission has a meeting every month, and anybody can go, and anybody gets 3 minutes to speak. Well, guess what I talk about?
What's your 3-minute pitch there?
Well, it's basically I just say, look, I've got a podcast. It's made right here in the little town of Safety Harbor, and it goes to 160 countries worldwide, and I've got over 12 million downloads now. And so I just say, look, it's a show that I talk to people who've been through something really unusual, like a plane crash or an animal attack or something like that, and they just come on the show and tell what happened. And I give the website and it's more detailed than that because you get 3 minutes, you might as well take the whole 3 minutes, right?
I love this idea of like it not being like one. There's no silver bullet. I keep saying this all the time. There's not. Everyone wants to. What's the one thing that's going to get me the thousands? And obviously, you can take the dirty route and the people who buy the clicks and the listens and like the 30-second listens, and obviously like they trick their sponsors into thinking because they'll show up on your podcast host as listens too. That's the sad part. And then I tried one I was testing out stuff and I got like thousands of downloads in quotes for those who are watching. And I was like, well, I could gamify this and just keep doing this and then keep showing sponsors this number, and they're like, oh, okay, you have the downloads. And I'm like, it just felt so icky. I was like, I can't do that. Like, I'd rather just slow and steady, always feels like it wins the race better.
And the sponsor would compare your show with that number of downloads with another show who has legitimate the same number of downloads. And why is that other show converting so much better? It hurts you in the long run. So yeah, no shortcuts.
So given that there's no silver bullets, what are the things that you see, tend to move the needle more when it comes to promotion?
Yeah, I would say definitely promo swaps. So you create a 30 or 60-second trailer or promo for your show, and you find another show that has a similar audience and maybe roughly the similar size audience, and then say, hey, why don't we just do an ad on each other's show? And it helps both. And I've also done probably the thing that made the biggest difference for me. This was, well, let's see, this was back in, I think it was in 2020. First time I did a full episode swap. And you've got to really be careful about that because now you're giving your audience a show that they didn't sign up for. So you got to know for sure it's something that they would want to listen to. And so around that time, I was getting, I think, maybe like 1,500 or 2,000 downloads a day. And after that swap, a couple days later, it doesn't happen immediately, but like 2 or 3 days later, it went to like 4,000 a day. And then it went after that to 6,000 a day, and that other episode is still live. So, and it's live in his episodes are live in my show too. So we're still getting new listeners from that, from 4 years ago. So
And he just basically ran a version of his episode on your show.
exactly. And I did the same thing on his. And it was the beautiful thing was, the audience trusts the host. And the way he introduced my show is he said, I get listeners all the time asking me, what's another show? His show's called This Is Actually Happening. And it's very similar stories. And so he says, I get people asking me, what's another show just like this one? Because I've already listened to all of your episodes. Now I've got a show I can tell you about.
Oh, that's awesome.
And man, that was a big thing.
I did a swap with someone, and I feel bad because I forgot his name, but he was, we swapped host roles. So he hosted my show. So when people came on, they heard, "Hey," and he was the host of my show for that episode, and I was the host of his show, and he ran it on his. So it's kind of a similar thing. So it was kind of a, but to your point, I think what it's just a reminder to everyone that's watching and listening, just to experiment, like to try things. You're the producer of the show. Like you literally can do anything you want. You can, it's your show, it's your stage, and you can try silly things, fun things, crazy things, and if they don't work, they don't work, but you don't know. And I'm sure that you're finding out with all these notes that you're taking for this book that you're going to publish, like, you just sometimes there's things that have been big flops.
Oh, I've had some big flops, but you don't know till you do it. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's worth it.
And it's key to have, it sounds like you have a process around what happens when an episode goes live, which I think is important. It's some of the stuff we talk about with, I own a podcast agency, and we've got SOPs. And so, when client shows comes out, there's a certain number of things that we do. And even with my show is like the crash test dummy. So I'm just like, okay, let's test this, and we test this. And I'm always testing new things out, but I think there's no shortage of like little things you can do. And I think when you find the things that work, I think it sounds like you have a process in place, like you go to those 40, 50 groups and the Reddit groups and everything. And so I imagine there's like a checklist of stuff.
Oh, I live by checklists. Absolutely. Yeah. It's not a paper checklist. I've got it in an app called Notion.
Yeah, Notion's, I love Notion. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I've got it all in there. And so anytime a new episode comes out, I just go down the list and I already have the links, so I can just copy and paste. And the 60 or so Facebook groups that I post in, those are all designed specifically for promoting podcasts. So really they're full of people promoting podcasts. That's all it is. But I still get listeners from it. But the other thing is there's a local Facebook group probably in every city just talking about what's going on locally. It's like here locally, there's a thing called a group called Palm Harbor Happenings. It's a city that's near here, and they've got like 25,000 people in there. And on Mondays, businesses can post. So it's on my calendar every Monday. That's, whatever. If I had an episode the previous Friday, Monday morning, it's posted in there. And I've, I was out riding my bike one time, and I had somebody wave and say, "Hey, I'm listening to your podcast right now." And that's how local people find out about it.
That's such a great point. And I think it's really just having a discipline and a checklist, and like, okay, we're going to go to, and just, it takes time. I mean, I can't imagine, it's not a small task to have the time. It's, probably sounds like hours of, work just to kind of get through all and post it and be consistent and doing it repeatedly over, episodes.
But that's what it takes. To me, it's a non-negotiable. If I have a new episode coming out, this is a list of stuff I got to do, and it's just I just have to get it done that day.
Awesome. So a couple of questions as we wrap up that we ask every guest. First one is, what's something that you've changed your mind about recently?
I had to think about this one, but I do have one. I tend to really like creativity. And the reverse of that is for people that just, copy what other people are doing. I don't know, it's just kind of a pet peeve of mine. And so I would be out in, doing whatever, out in traffic or parking my car, or whatever. And I would see a Jeep in the parking lot, and it would have all these little rubber duckies along the dashboard. And I kept seeing that over and over. And I thought, what is it with Jeep people that they just have to be like everybody else, having all these little rubber duckies lined up? And then I looked it up, what it actually is. And it's actually there's nothing bad about it. It's called Jeep ducking. And people give each other these rubber duckies when they're admiring their Jeep. And so the more you have, that's the more people have done, an act of kindness. They're appreciating. So yeah, I just, I jumped to a conclusion as to what that meant. And obviously I was wrong. So I changed my mind.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. And when you figure out what it's for, I'd be curious about like how that started. Those things like that, how it start. Like, who was the first person to do that?
Right, right. Yeah, it would be interesting.
What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
The most misunderstood thing is not necessarily about me specifically, but part of a group that I identify with, and I'm a vegan. And a lot of times you say vegan or veganism, and you picture, the PETA group, and they're throwing fake blood on somebody with a fur coat or something, or just someone just yammering on and on and on about, don't eat meat and all. most vegans that I know aren't like that. I mean, of course, there's exceptions to everything, but for the most part, whatever you want to eat, you eat. I'm going to do the same thing, and we're all happy. So, I think vegans in general are kind of
Get a bad rap.
good. Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's people listening to this right now saying, "Oh, no way! I know some who are constantly preaching at me," but
And if you're a vegan and if you got a really interesting story, that'd make for a good conversation on the.
oh man, I've had yeah, yeah.
The vegan could tell you the first time they ate meat.
Or mistakenly ate meat. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you be interested in eating the cellular, like, the fish that they're growing from cells? Is that considered like, because they're now going into in a lab, they're taking the cells of the protein, whatever they're doing, and they're essentially like doing it in a way where they can. It's cultured seafood, but it's grown, but it's made from the cells and the proteins of an actual fish. So it's not like some Frankenstein thing. And then when they give it to like these chefs, like sushi chefs now, I've been trying this like sushi grade tuna that's been cultured and grown in a lab, and they really cannot tell the difference. So it's not over farming. It's not farming. It's not fishing at all. That's which I think it's interesting.
So does the fish have to die for them?
There's no. It's grown from a cell, like in a dish, and so and they basically give it life enough, like whatever nutrients it needs, so that and you essentially end up with the protein part of a fish. It was never an actual fish swimming in the ocean. Look it up. I mean, it's interesting because, and they're doing it now with like meat too, like cultured meat. And I think in a way, it's solving some of the challenges of like food production and factory farming, which is like very horrible stuff. And
A lot of bad stuff in that. Yeah.
I've grown. I've had more of an awareness of like you know, taking a look at where my food comes from. Now that I'm in Minnesota, my partner's family, her dad was a hunter, and there's something about like goes fishing and like getting the direct contact and having respect and honor for the animal, and like hunting something that you hunted yourself and you had to like dress it yourself, and going through that entire experience. And then like there's something different having lived in New York City and LA, like you're so disconnected from your food source. So it's never like a black and white discussion, but it's always been interesting to kind of have seen how my views have changed on some of that stuff over the years.
It is an interesting discussion. Definitely. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming to my talk. Number one, thank you so much. It's always nerve wracking to see you don't want to show up and like there's no one in the audience there.
Well, honestly, Harry, I mean, come on, you've been around a long time. People know who you are, and they're going to want to come and listen to what you say, as they did. And I have friends that were in that talk too, and they said, "Yeah, actually, one of them told me today they just got an email from you today saying, hey, thanks for coming. Here's the slide deck, or whatever." Her name's Kiona.
Oh, Kiona, yeah.
Yeah, she has a show. I'll give her a little plug here. She's got a show called Birth as We Know It, where she has people come on and tell their story of giving birth. And it's a wonderful storytelling podcast. I subscribe to it, and she's really good at that too.
Yeah, there's a whole subgenre of like not necessarily true crime, but like actual storytelling podcasts, which I'm sure you're probably dialed into all of them. So yeah. Well, thanks so much. And I go to Podcast Move and I go to these conferences to connect with folks. And I always come back with like people that I want to have on the show. And a lot of times it's just friends. I'm I'll say, Dave, we haven't talked in a while. And it's hard to catch up at a conference because there's so much things going on. You think you're going to have a catch up. And so I've got 3 or 4 chats coming up on the show from people that were just like friends that I just like, we kind of talk at the conference, but it's usually in a bar and it's very noisy and you get like 10 or 15 minutes. But I'm like, I want to focus an hour of my attention on you and tell your story. And that's why I just feel like I'll never give up the platform, because it's just I can have on, and have these types of conversations whenever I feel like it.
Right. Yeah. There's no other environment where we can do this, really. It's
No, if we had tried to do this at the show, it would have been like a 5-minute conversation.
right, right. And you don't go into any depth at all there.
No, and we don't have our nice mics and our environment. So I really appreciate you again, coming up and just giving us this opportunity to have this chat, because I learned a lot about like what you're doing, and I think it's going to be fascinating for folks to hear all the different flavors of podcasting. But like you've definitely got some interesting stories to share from your show. So thanks, Scott.
My pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. And if you ever have anything really unusual happen to you, I want to hear about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would want that to happen, but if it's the lottery or if I become a millionaire in the next 12 months, I'll definitely. I'll let you know what that's like. Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Where's the best place to send folks to learn more?
The show's on all of the Apple platforms or Spotify or any podcast app, or they can get all the information right at whatwasthatlike.com.
Okay. I'm going to have all the links in the show notes as well. Thanks again, Scott.
Cool. Thank you.